Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be looking at Lyme disease. Now, I know you're a medical microbiologist, so you already know the basics. But we've got some interesting findings from Microbiology, the CDC, and Microbe Canvas.
Oh, cool.
To give you a bit of a deeper understanding of Lyme disease, I think you'll find it quite fascinating, some of the aspects of it.
Yeah.
Especially the diagnostic challenges and some of the new research.
Sounds good.
Let's kick things off by talking about the bacteria that cause Lyme disease, Borrelia.
Right.
These spirochetes, particularly the species within the Borrelia burgdorferi sensilato complex, these are pretty fascinating organisms, right?
Yeah, they're pretty interesting. One of the interesting things about them is that they're microaerophilic, so they need low oxygen levels to survive and grow.
Okay.
And that actually makes them very hard to culture in the lab, which has big implications when it comes to diagnosis.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how a bacteria's basic biological needs can have such a significant impact on our ability to identify it and treat the infection that it causes.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Lyme disease presents a lot of complexities for medical professionals.
It really does.
Speaking of challenges, let's talk about the clinical presentation of Lyme disease. I understand that it can manifest in a wide variety of ways,
Right.
which makes the diagnosis even harder.
It does. It's often described as the great imitator because its symptoms can look like so many other conditions.
Oh, okay.
That's because Borrelia can spread throughout the whole body, and it can affect all these different organ systems.
Right, and we often hear about that classic erythema, migrans, rash, but I understand that's not always present, and even when it is, it may not have that typical bullseye appearance.
Yeah, that's true. And the fact that there's not a distinct rash can lead to it being misdiagnosed.
Right.
Or treatment being delayed, which obviously can have really serious consequences for the patient. And to add to that puzzle, sometimes the Lyme disease symptoms can look like other conditions, like multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, even fibromyalgia.
Wow.
So it can be really tricky.
So relying solely on that clinical presentation can be very misleading.
Yeah.
What about lab testing?
Yeah.
Are there any reliable diagnostic tools for Lyme disease?
Well, lab testing is crucial in confirming it, but it's not without its limitations.
Okay.
Serological tests like the ELISA and Western blot are commonly used, but how sensitive they are really depends on the stage of the infection.
So false negatives are possible?
Oh yeah, especially in those early stages.
Okay.
When the antibody levels might not be high enough to be detected yet.
I see.
And even later on, those serological tests can be pretty hard to interpret, especially when the clinical picture isn't clear.
So it sounds like diagnosing Lyme disease requires a combination of careful clinical observation, patient history, and really looking at those lab results. There's no one single test that can tell us for sure.
You got it. A comprehensive approach is essential.
Okay.
And even then, Lyme disease can be a real puzzle.
Before we move on to prevention and treatment, I want to touch on something else that adds to the complexity. Co-infections. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so ticks can carry multiple different pathogens.
Okay.
So someone who gets bitten by a tick that's infected could end up with more than just Borrelia.
So they might have Lyme disease, but also other tick-borne illnesses.
Right.
Like ehrlichiosis or babesiosis.
Exactly.
So that makes the diagnosis and treatment even more complicated.
Absolutely. That possibility of co-infections just throws another wrench in the whole thing.
Wow.
It really underscores the need to think broadly when you're evaluating patients with tick bites.
It sounds like Lyme disease really keeps us on our toes,
It does.
constantly challenging our understanding and demanding a nuanced approach to patient care.
It definitely does. Lyme disease is a great example of how complex the interplay can be between a host and a pathogen.
Yeah, for sure. So let's dig into that a little bit. Microbiologically speaking, what is it about Borrelia that makes it so good at dodging our immune system?
Well, Borrelia has this whole bag of tricks it uses to survive. Like, one really cool thing is that they can change their surface proteins all the time.
Oh, wow.
It's called antigenic variation, and it basically means our immune cells have a really hard time recognizing and targeting them.
Oh, so they're like constantly changing their disguise?
Exactly. They're like little masters of disguise, and it makes it much harder for our bodies to mount a good immune response.
Wow.
But wait, there's more.
Okay.
They can also release these molecules that actually suppress the immune system directly.
What?
Yeah, these molecules mess with the normal pathways that would usually activate an immune response.
So it's like they're disarming our defenses.
Pretty much, yeah. They're making a nice, cozy environment for themselves to hang out in.
Wow.
Oh, and on top of all that, they can even invade and hide inside our own cells. So they're basically shielded from any kind of immune detection or attack.
That's incredible. It's no wonder Lyme disease can be so tough to treat sometimes.
It's a real testament to how they've evolved to be so good at what they do. And if we want to come up with better diagnostic tools and treatment strategies, we really have to understand these mechanisms.
Right, for sure. So speaking of that, what are some of the exciting new things happening in Lyme disease research? Are there any promising new approaches on the horizon?
There's definitely a lot going on. One area where there's a lot of activity is developing new kinds of diagnostic tests. Because as we were talking about, the current serological tests aren't perfect, especially early in the infection.
Right, and those false negatives can lead to delays in diagnosis and treatment, and that gives the bacteria more time to spread and potentially cause more serious problems.
Exactly. So researchers are looking at all sorts of different things. Like some are looking for brand new biomarkers that might be more sensitive at picking up early infection, while others are trying to find ways to make the existing tests more sensitive.
Okay.
There's a lot of different approaches.
That makes sense. What about treatments? Are there any new therapies in the pipeline that offer hope for people dealing with long-term symptoms?
Yeah, there's a lot of work going on there too. Antibiotics are still the go-to for Lyme disease, but people are starting to get really interested in exploring other types of treatment, especially for patients who still have symptoms even after they've finished antibiotics.
Right, and I've heard a little bit about research into immunotherapies.
Yeah, immunotherapies are definitely one thing people are looking into. The idea is to kind of kickstart the body's own immune system into fighting Borrelia more effectively to help clear the infection.
I see.
So that's one avenue.
And of course, the holy grail would be a vaccine. Where do things stand with Lyme disease vaccine development right now?
Well, there have been some bumps in the road, but researchers are still plugging away at it. They're looking at new vaccine candidates and different ways of giving the vaccine, hoping to find something that's safe, effective, and provides long-lasting protection against Lyme disease.
I mean, a good vaccine would be huge. It could really reduce the number of Lyme disease cases we see and prevent a lot of suffering.
It would be a game changer for sure. But developing vaccines is really complicated. It takes a lot of time and effort, but the potential benefits make it worth it.
Absolutely. Let's switch gears for a minute and talk about Lyme disease from a public health perspective.
Sure.
It's definitely a big concern, and the impact goes way beyond individual cases.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I imagine that the rising number of Lyme disease cases puts a lot of strain on our healthcare systems.
For sure, it does. More and more cases means we need more resources, and it requires a real coordinated public health response. We need good surveillance and monitoring to keep track of how Lyme disease is spreading, to know which areas are high risk, and to be able to plan good prevention strategies.
And education is a big part of that too, right? Making sure people know about the risk and what they can do to protect themselves is essential.
Definitely. Public health campaigns are really important for that, educating people about things like what to look for, how to prevent tick bites, and why it's so important to get diagnosed and treated early if you do get infected. Even simple things like wearing the right clothes, using insect repellent, and checking yourself for ticks can make a big difference.
And then there's also the whole issue of tick control, which I'm sure keeps public health agencies busy.
Oh, absolutely. Tick control is a multi-pronged approach. It involves everything from changing the environment to make it less tick-friendly, to using targeted pesticides, to even using biological controls to try to reduce tick populations.
Yeah, it really emphasizes that preventing Lyme disease takes everyone working together, individuals, communities, and public health professionals all have a part to play.
It's a team effort for sure. Public health initiatives are essential in minimizing how much Lyme disease spreads and protecting vulnerable people.
It's been really interesting to explore all these facets of Lyme disease.
It really highlights how important it is to stay informed about the latest research and to appreciate all the different dimensions of this disease.
Yeah, and for medical microbiologists like yourself, it's a reminder that the world of microbes is constantly changing and that we need to keep learning.
It sure is, and it shows how important our role is in keeping people healthy.
Absolutely. As we wrap up, let's zero in on a couple of things that might particularly pique your interest as a medical microbiologist. The genetic diversity of Borrelia. It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
It is, yeah. The Borrelia burgdorferi sensulato complex, you've got all these different genospecies within it, and each one's got its own little quirks, its own characteristics. And they're not all found in the same places either. Their geographic distribution is different.
Right. And that diversity, it affects everything.
Yeah.
From how the disease presents in patients all the way to how we develop vaccines for it.
Absolutely. Some species are associated with certain symptoms or, particular ways that the disease manifests. So like you take Borrelia garini, that one's often linked with neurological issues, whereas Borrelia fazellii, that one tends to cause more skin-related things like acrodermatitis, chronica, trophicans.
Wow, it's fascinating how these tiny genetic variations within the Borrelia species can make such a huge difference in how the disease plays out. And it makes developing a vaccine that works against all the different clinically relevant Borrelia genospecies pretty tricky, right?
But yeah, it's a major obstacle. You've got to create a vaccine that can target all those different types, and that's a tough nut to crack. But researchers are definitely working on it. It's just a very complex process.
It really makes you appreciate all the work that goes into vaccine development and how important it is to have a deep understanding of the pathogen's genes. Now, we talked a little bit about co-infections earlier. From a microbiological standpoint, how do these co-infections complicate things?
Well, when you've got co-infections, they can really throw a wrench in the works in terms of the host's immune response and how the disease progresses. Having multiple pathogens in there at the same time can create this really complex mix of immune reactions, making it much harder to figure out what's going to happen with the disease and what the best way to treat it is.
So you can't just treat each infection separately. You have to consider how all those different pathogens are interacting with each other.
Exactly. Co-infections add this whole other layer of complexity to a disease that's already pretty complex to begin with. It really emphasizes the need to look at the big picture, to take a holistic approach when you're diagnosing and treating someone.
Lyme disease is a constant reminder that the world of microbes is full of surprises, and that we have to keep learning and adapting.
Couldn't agree more. Our work as medical microbiologists is never done. There's always something new to discover and new challenges to tackle. It's what makes it so fascinating, right?
Absolutely. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Lyme disease. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the basic biology of Borrelia to the cutting-edge research that's happening right now, and we even touched on the public health implications of this intricate disease. We hope this deep dive has given you some fresh perspectives and a deeper appreciation for the ever-changing world of medical microbiology. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep those minds sharp.